Tim is a professor at Carleton University. He started there in the late 1980s, and we met at that time. He came in as a young hotshot doing climatology, environmental stuff. I don't really know much more than that, Tim, but he's definitely one of the leaders in that community within North American context and beyond. It's actually a great pleasure that he was able to join us today. And in the email link that I sent out, we included his link to his research group that is extremely active, at least I know within the Canadian context right across Canada. So take it away, Tim.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very privileged to talk to the Atlantic Geoscience Society, and I've got to come and pay my dues because although I'm at Carleton University in Ottawa, I have a major interest in the region, in particular because I'm a native of Harvey Station, New Brunswick, which is just southwest of Fredericton. And so I grew up there, and I go back there every year. And it's actually, in the last few years, has become sort of a major research area for my group in very many ways. That some of it has been trying to get something going to look at the cyanobacteria issue that we'll be talking about today, but also some other test beds that we've been kind of looking at sort of various sorts of ecological and paleolimnological research in some of the area lakes. So without further ado, then I'm going to jump into the talk today, which is basically a discussion of looking at we'll get there eventually, a 500-year record of major storms that have impacted Harvey Lake. And towards the end of the presentation today, after I go through all the reasons how we were able to recognize these storm records, what are the possible implications for cyanobacteria bloom formation? And that's, of course, a major issue in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia as well, because in the last few years, more and more lakes have had cyanobacteria blooms, and that has created some problems for cottagers and many other people in the region. So the research questions today are, first of all, are there records of major storms preserved in lake records in that part of the world? And can these sedimentary storm records that we might recognize in a core, can we correlate those with known historical storm events? And if we're reaching far enough back in time, of course, will be prehistorical. And finally, do these major storms, is there any sort of contribution to cyanobacteria bloom events? So the first slide I thought I'd show here is basically there have been a slide that shows the distribution of they call them paleotempestology research, and this is in the Western North Atlantic Basin. And there's only been, a surprise to me, 61 previous studies. Most of them are on coastal areas or in islands in the region. Only one is inland, that's number 38 you can see here. And if you look it up, it was actually a tree ring study. So it's not really looking at any sort of a lake record. And if you go north of 12 on the map, which seems to be in southern Maine, nothing in the Atlantic region at all that have gone to look at paleostorm records. So if cyanobacteria aside, if we're able to recognize any of these sort of paleo storm records, that will be of scientific significance. But first of all, a bit of an overview of what I do. I'm these days a paleolimnologist, and basically I go and look at lake records. And in these lake records, they are archiving a complete record, generally, if you're in the right place, of changes over time through which the various sorts of communities that have lived in these lakes, they're flowing and evolving. So a lake doesn't stay the same forever. These ecosystems are perpetually changing as climate changes over time, as human development might occur, agriculture, building cities, or whatever. They're going to have an influence upon these lake systems. And this little slide right here is a nice summary, and I'm not going to go through it in great detail here, but basically shows that all the sorts of things that might be going on around a lake, from say rivers are introducing sedimentary particles into a lake. You might have some industrial factories, and they're going to be dropping particles into the lake. There's going to be various runoff from industries. You're going to have the organisms living in the lake themselves, and all that material, again, it's ebbing and flowing over time. It'll accumulate on the lake bottom, and when it accumulates there, the sediments begin to pile up, and the lakes are perpetually filling up because of that. And these records will provide a record of how this lake has evolved over time. And in this particular diagram, you can see there are 3 different core records in here, and they're all not quite exactly the same, although they can correlate quite well with each other. But that's sort of an important takeaway as part of the talk I'm going to give today, is where is the best place to go into a lake, take a core to actually collect a record of a proxy that you're interested in. And so I think this is sort of a nice summary diagram to show that. So the main, the study area today that I'm going to be talking about is Harvey Lake. And Harvey Lake on the map of New Brunswick right here is in the southwestern corner of the province. And here's a nice little map drawn here of the lake, which basically shows its physiography. It's not terribly big. It's about 6 kilometers long, only about 1.25 kilometers wide. It's about 26 square kilometers. And the maximum depth is down here in the southern part of the lake, and there's a big Z right here, and that's for Zmax, the deepest part of the lake. And the community of Harvey is just off the map. In here, the village of Harvey Station. There's variously it's called Cherry Hill or Cherry Mountain, is right beside it, and this is geologically speaking is the Cherry Mountain volcanic rocks are found there, and there's a few inlets and a little outlet to the lake as well. And here's a nice photograph on a dark and stormy night of Harvey taken in Harvey Cove right here. So this diagram here basically shows the distribution of hurricanes from about the middle part of the 19th century up to 2018, and it is a real spaghetti diagram. Hurricanes are generally originating either off the coast of Africa or in the eastern part of the Atlantic or in the Caribbean region, and then they are spinning up the coast. Sometimes they'll stay at sea and sometimes they'll come ashore. The highest concentration, of course, are going to be in the southeastern part of North America, but occasionally you'll have a major storm penetrate into the Atlantic region, and it will be, when they arrive, sometimes it can be with quite devastating results. This is a scale here, and you'll become more familiar with this as the season goes on, because I understand from reading in some of the reports coming out now that this is projected to be potentially a very active hurricane season in the Atlantic, and hurricanes are scaled on this Saffir-Simpson scale by tropical depressions, tropical storms, and then you move to Cat 1 up to Cat 5 storms, and here are the wind speeds that go along with these things. Now, as a hurricane spins across a lake, it's going to have some potential impacts. For one thing, there's usually a lot of rain goes along with a hurricane, and that's going to result in an increase in the amount of runoff. You also have severe winds, and this is in the right side of this diagram right here, and these winds will result in large waves. So there's 2 things going on. So lots of runoff and then some big waves are associated with that. There's also another scale, the Beaufort wind scale, which was developed in the early part of the 19th century, 1805, which was basically to quantify the wind speeds as observed at sea or on land for sailors, because somebody's moderate breeze might be quite different from somebody else's moderate breeze. And so this Sir Francis Beaufort tried to quantify that. And so here's the different sorts of wind speeds. I won't go through that, but it goes from all the way from calm up to greater than 118 kilometers per hour would be hurricanes, and then there's everything in between that. So as these waves that are being influenced by major storms are building up on a lake, the wave base is going to become progressively deeper. And this diagram right here shows basically the wavelength between a wave if you can see this little vertical stress and the horizontal stress, these little circles going on here, is basically the depth of the wave base that's associated with a wavelength of a wave here is WL divided by 2. And so, and then you have what's known as a fair weather wave base, or sort of the average sorts of conditions. And then as the winds pick up, the waves get larger and larger, that wave base gets deeper and deeper until you get down to something called the storm wave base. And as you penetrate deeper into the water column, you're going to start to have an influence upon the seabed, or in this case, the lake bed, and start to stir these sediments up. So the maximum depth then at which the waves passage, and it causes a significant water motion. So this is a diagram of Harvey Lake. And basically it shows here a theoretical theoretical mixing depth on Harvey Lake according to the Beaufort wind scale. So the scale on here is in, I keep clicking this by accident, sorry, I apologize, my mouse is too sensitive in here. You end up with these, as the scale goes up, calm, and so these very, very shallow areas along the margins of Harvey Lake are, practically any wind at all is going to disturb those sediments, okay? And then as you move deeper and deeper into deeper parts of the lake, you're going to have a greater and greater, it's going to take larger wind speeds in order to influence those waves. And the whole reason why you want to think about this is, if I'm going into this lake and I want to collect a core that's going to record storms, or it's going to record any sort of paleolimnological proxy that I'm interested in, I need to get deep enough so that I can actually get a relatively undisturbed record. So most people, when they go into a lake and do research, they're heading off to something, the ZMAX, the deepest part of the lake. But is that always the best place to take your core if you're trying to collect information on a particular proxy? In this case, we're trying to find records of storms. So is that the best place to go, as the deepest part of the lake, or should we go into some other place? And so this map here shows the distribution of theoretical mixing depths. This diagram is the Beaufort wind scale, but in this case, this is the actual mixing probability that has occurred. And this is based on the Fredericton Airport Climate Station records, dating all the way back from 1953 up to 2015. So looking at the hourly wind speeds, and as the crow flies, the Fredericton Airport isn't all that far away. And so based on the wind speeds there, this gives an idea of how deep the waves, or how big the waves have been, and how deep that these waves have penetrated into the water column in Harvey Lake. And it ends up that some of these places will start down here, say less than or equal to 100. These parts, very shallow in Harvey Lake, practically all the time, have been stirred up by waves. So the waves are stirring them perpetually. And as we move to progressively have actually penetrated to the substrate here, become reduced in time. Okay, so we move on and on and on, and it ends up that in this lake, we end up with the deepest part of the lake. We end up with, there has never been any wave, no waves associated with any sort of winds that have occurred since 1953 have influenced this region. So this is our deepest part of the lake. So in Harvey Lake, it ends up that there's been no direct wave impact below 4.4 meters water depth in the interval from 1953 basically up to the present time. So if you were going to look for a core location in Harvey Lake, this is without even going to Harvey Lake, if you went to any place on this lake deeper than 4.4 meters water depth, it hasn't been stirred up by waves. That's not to say you're not going to be stirred up by something else, but you're not going to have an influence. So before we talk then about hunting for hurricanes and what influence they might have had, I think it'd be interesting to look at what some previous storms, what impact they've had. So the first one that's most recent in people's minds is post-tropical storm Arthur, which tracked over New Brunswick on July 5th of 2014. And it was the first named hurricane of the Atlantic hurricane season of that year. And it initially started off in the southeastern US on June 28th, and then progressed its way upward along the coast, and it reached wind speeds of something like 155 kilometers per hour. This is what it looked like as it tracked over New Brunswick on July the 5th. And it had accumulated precipitation. There were high wind speeds recorded, and speaking with people in the Harvey area in particular, it took the power out for quite a long time. There were very high winds. There were heavy rainfall recorded throughout southwestern New Brunswick at Gagetown. There was 150 millimeters of rain. At the Fredericton Airport is 120. And in the Harvey area, and I got this little yellow star here, I'm not sure if it shows up in this generally garish sorts of colors here, but the rainfall varied from 110 to 130 kilometers, 130 millimeters. So that's a considerable amount of rain fell. And here's an interesting little video clip I'm going to show here, and it was provided by Stephen Fox, who lives in the area of Harvey Lake. And here's, I think, is interesting what he had to say. He said, Arthur, took out our entire shoreline, primarily because the water rose so much and so rapidly. I remember that they had forecast the wind, but what no one expected was the amount of rainfall. So they ended up with a huge amount of rain. So this is in a place called the southwestern part of Harvey Lake. We're looking towards, this is Cherry Mountain or Cherry Hill, but let's have a look here at what the waves are doing. And I think it's also interesting when you see that the water is completely brown. So these winds have stirred up the lake and created a huge amount of disturbance in the lake. So what happens here then with something like Arthur crosses across a lake? You end up with the sediment runoff. So we've got a lot of rainfall, nearly 130 millimeters of rain occurred with that event. So it's coming in through all the streams, it's coming off the landscape and flowing down into the lake. And so we get little particles going in here. We end up with now the wave base is being depressed because the waves now are so large. So you have all the sediment running in from the side. We also have now no longer just the fair weather wave base, but the storm wave base. So we're now picking up sediment from much deeper in the lake bed and mixing that up into the water column. And so you end up, when things finally calm down, the sediment will now, that was resuspended and washed off the landscape, are all mixed up together, and they will start to sink down to the lake bottom, where they will form a sedimentary layer. Now, in the very shallow parts of the lake, that's going to happen, but it doesn't matter, because these parts of the lakes are perpetually being impacted by waves under very moderate wind conditions. So to find a preserved record of something like Hurricane Arthur or post-tropical storm Arthur that passed across this region, you need in this lake to get down to depths of greater than 4.4 meters to look at a core. So this is where you'd want to go, and then you'd be looking at some characteristic of the sediments that are found there that might hint that this was related to a major storm. So what we did in Harvey Lake as part of an initial part of this study was in 2015, the year after the storm, we collected 100 samples throughout the lake area. This was with the assistance of some people from UNB, Helen Rowe, who's on the line here today, and my father, actually a key contributor boat as well. So we were going all over the lake and collected these samples. So this was the year after Hurricane Arthur. So if there's any record of Hurricane Arthur, it was laying right on the lake bottom. And so we were trying to figure out, and also what we were interested in at that time, I'd already been speaking with Cheryl Bartlett, who's on the line as well. She's the chairperson of the New Brunswick Alliance of Lake Associations. And we were already talking about the issues of cyanobacteria and because that lake that summer was having a major problem with the cyanobacteria bloom, which it had never had before. So there's all kinds of things are in play all at the same time here. And so just on the corner here, there's a paper based on this research, on the first part of the research I'm discussing today, which is now in review at Springer Nature Applied Sciences. So what we did with these samples, we had many uses for them. There was ones we were doing eye tracks analysis, with grain size analysis, all kinds of other analysis were done on them, we took them back to my lab where I have a Beckman-Coulter laser diffraction particle size analyzer, and we ran them. So 100 these 100 surface samples. And conventionally, when you do grain size analysis, what you're basically breaking it down to is sand size, silt size, clay, and this is like this diagram in the corner. And so you can look at them, it's a ternary plot, so it's basically relative abundance of each thing. And that can provide you with some reasonable information about the nature of runoff in the spring and storms and droughts and so on. And in Harvey Lake, just looking at it from that category, it ends up the more northern part of the lake is generally finer to coarser sands make up the substrate. So very fine sands, kind of the middle, and sort of clays down towards the south and western part of the lake. And so conventionally, if you were looking for a place to go collect cores, it would be sort of in areas where the sediments are finer, because you're going to have a more discrete sedimentary record, and so it tends to be a more subtle sorts of signals there. So that'd be sort of your first tip that what you would do. However, we have another approach that we take now, and it's called in-member mixing analysis. And what it does is sort of goes further than you do when you just look at the basic sand, silt, and clay, and starts to look at the sort of a multimodal distribution of grains. And there's a person here holding a handful of lake sediment, and this one's quite sandy, sometimes it'd be quite muddy as well. But if you looked at these grain size distributions there, they would have a lot of different types of grains that would be distributed all the way from clays on up to coarse sands. And what we analyze them is using this package. It's called, again, it's in-member mixing analysis, and we use the RStudio package to try and recognize the various subpopulations that are found within these distributions. And they're very useful, this sort of a new technology, because it allows you to recognize more subtle indicators of where the sediment came from, how it was transported, and eventually how it was deposited. And it's analyzed using multivariate analysis, factor analysis, principal component analysis. And so basically what it does is takes these populations, mixes them, and then through expert analysis, it couples them with various sorts of natural processes that might have gone on, and that provides you with an interpretation of these distributions as to what it might mean. Is it a storm? Is it spring runoff? And so this is the information you get. And this diagram right here is actually shows the distribution of the sediments from those 100 Harvey Lake surface sediments. So this is the base distribution of these. Now the trick is to break them down and recognize what are the various in-members that are found in here and what might they mean. And so this is shows that in that distribution, there were 4 distinct in-members were recognized. So this shows their profiles all the way from clays up to very coarse sands. And so you can follow the blue one, for example, it has a tail and then it's peaking somewhere in the coarse silt, and then it falls off again, and some of the other ones are a little bit different. Well, it ends up that when we took these in-members and we did a statistical comparison against the Beaufort wind scale data that we had, only one of them had a statistically significant correlation with wind speed. And that ended up being in-member 2, which has a peak right here in the very coarse silt, and then it falls off right here. So it had 0.7 correlation with that. And we interpreted that as a result of a combination, as I just showed you, of runoff. And this is, again, we were looking at the very surface sediments. So we were looking at basically Hurricane Arthur, the distribution of sediments that were derived from that. Again, it's a combination of sediment being picked up by waves and material running off from the landscape, sitting up in the water column, being carried all over the lake and dropping out everywhere. And so this is what we were seeing. So we say that was a result of this wind runoff and resuspension. And this diagram right here shows the distribution of in-member 2. And this shows where it's most abundant. So it's most abundant in the southwestern part of the lake. This is, interestingly, again, I mentioned people often are always heading off to do their coring in the ZMAX because it's the best place to go, and so it's the deep water right here. But interestingly, slightly shallower area, just to the north of the ZMAX, was the highest concentration of this in member 2, which is the one that we interpret as being derived from Hurricane Arthur, and some other places as well, a little bit shallower that you found this as well. So this shows the places you would go. So it tells you that over in this region, this is not a good place to go if you're going to look for records down in a core that would be similar to Hurricane Arthur, because the percentages are much, much lower. So this was sort of a very useful tool for us to try and recognize these distributions. And so this little stars right here kind of show us of places that if I was going to go back again or to collect a core, this is where you go. And sort of this triangular region here, in the opening part of this little cove, which is Herbert's Cove. This is Harvey Cove, which I can tell you from experience, this is not a good place to go, because there used to be some major lumber mill up in this area, and this bottom of this cove is completely covered with bits and pieces of wood. So you're not going to get much of a core out of that place. So we had this distributional information. So we decided, let's go out and try and collect a freeze core. And I'll talk more about freeze cores towards the end of the talk, where they're really an excellent type of coring tool to get actually perfect cores. But we ran into some technical problems. This is the raft we had here with our core. So we didn't actually make it to where we wanted to go coring. But so we ended up going into Herbert's Cove right here and collecting a glue core. And so this is Nalif Nasser, and here's Veronica Mazzella, who did her thesis on the surface sediments in here, and some of my other people in my team. And we did a glue core, and this is a gravity core that you just drop in the bottom of the lake and collected about 30-some centimeters of material. And then millimeter by millimeter, we took this sediment off, and then we analyzed that in the grain size machine as well. From that core, we collected 300 samples. We analyzed them at 1 millimeter resolution. And again, where we collected from was right around here, the mouth of Herbert's Cove, which was not as good as here, but we had some technical problems. That was about as good as we were going to get, and we ended up with a reasonable core record. This in-member mixing analysis distributional chart shows the distributions. They're pretty reasonably consistent in that particular core, again, in the sort of the coarse silt range. When we broke them down, 3 end members were present in that core. 2 of them, of the 3, were ones that seemed to be associated with storm type of deposits in here. And when we, so here's the sort of a blow up of that, looking at this, of the storm wave base one here. Here's another major storm resuspension, and they see the tails kind of fall off here. And then the third end member we recognized was a different sort of process in here. So it was much finer. So it might have been some sort of runoff that was related to that. This diagram here shows an overlay, and this is the end member 2 that I described to you earlier when we looked at the surface sediments. And remember, end member 2 was what the end member that we correlated with Hurricane Arthur crossing across the lake. It picked up sediments from the lake bottom in shallow areas, as well as the runoff from that huge amount of rain, all mixed them up together, carried them all around the lake and dropped them. And so this is the sediments from the surface, and that record from Hurricane Arthur correlated very well with this end member from down the core. There was a second one here as well that's even coarser, but the one that we had that correlated well with that major storm event is this one right here. And we look down the core, and again, we have an age model with that, and it goes all the way from the present back to the late part of the 1400s in this particular case. This shows the distribution of the 3 end members who were recognized in the core. Again, they add up to each other, so it's cumulative. So if there's something's 20%, another one will be 40%, then the other one will be 40%. So this shows the distribution down the core, and we can find records of major storms back through time that we are interpreting based on looking at the Hurricane Arthur record that we saw in the sediments, the surface sediments. So before I talk about these core records, I think it'd be useful just to take a little side trip and talk about what storms have gone across the Harvey area that are documented. And the first one I'll mention is this famous Saxby gale, which had a huge influence throughout New Brunswick. It tracked over New Brunswick on the 24th and 25th of October of 1869. It was named after Martin Saxby. And a year earlier, he had predicted that there would be extremely high tides in the North Atlantic Ocean October 1st of 1869. And he said that if a major storm happened to pass through at that time, there would be a massive storm surges associated with that. And he wrote letters to the editor about that, and he predicted these extremely a major storm. It ended up that he got lucky, and he did predict or guess, I guess, that there was unfortunately, there was a major storm tracked across the region that went along with this major storm surge, and it went right across New Brunswick. And here it is going what it did. Say in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, 123 vessels were tossed onto the beach. In Campobello Island, there was 80 buildings destroyed. In St. John, there were buildings flooded to their upper floors. In Nova Scotia, there were major problems. 10-foot high tidal bore destroyed bridges in Moncton. So it had a major impact upon this region. And here it is as it tracks across Harvey. Okay, so we're coming across here into, this is into New Brunswick. Jim Abraham produced this diagram in 1999. I think he's on the line here today as well for a presentation. And so basically it created some very terrifying times for the people in this region on the evening of October 5th. In Fredericton, there were 50-year-old trees uprooted. A lot of under construction buildings were destroyed, a lot of barns and sheds were destroyed, and the gusts were up to 120 kilometers per hour. And in Harvey, that area, there was about 100 millimeters of rain fell. And I remember as a small boy, I'd go hunting with my father behind Oromocto Lake, which is very nearby there, and you'd see these great big trees, big pine trees, that had been snapped off well above my head. I could reach up and well, I was little, but maybe my father could reach up, and you could see where they were snapped off, and they were still kind of laying all in the same direction. And he told me that he had been told that that was a result of the passage of the Saxby gale. So it had a major impact upon that region. And here's what it did in the area. It says, as the day advanced, the breeze grew steadily stronger and the heat became oppressive, a recognized sign of high wind. And to the south, the sky was a dull leaden gray, becoming darker and more threatening by the moment. And by 5 o'clock, a veritable hurricane was blowing. And the extreme darkness, the constant roar and the tumult of wind and the lashing rain, the groaning of great trees, the hail of debris, shingles, slates, branches, objects large and small falling everywhere, roofs carried aloft, whole buildings collapsing, all gave the paralyzing sense of insecurity and calamity. So this was a very scary, and this was a report coming from Cork, which is just a few kilometers away from Harvey Lake. So this was a major problem, obviously, as this storm passed across the region. So let's go back now 100 years later. Another major storm tracked across the area, and it came right across New Brunswick as well. And in fact, it went right up the east side of Oromocto Lake, was just a few kilometers away. And it was a category 2 as it came across. It was 170 kilometer per hour winds as it came ashore in Maine. And there was something like almost 70 millimeters of rainfall on Harvey, and then through the next 3 days, another 39 millimeters. So it was like more than 100 millimeters of rain came along with this event as well. So these are 2 well-documented storms, in addition to Arthur, that we know had an impact. So as we look down this core, we have these end members. And I showed you which end member. End member 2 was the end member that was associated with Hurricane Arthur. I showed you the end members that were recognized down core in the core that we collected from Harvey Lake, and end member 2 correlated very closely with one of those. This diagram right here shows you the distribution down core of these end members, these coarser silt sediments that were found in there that were something similar to what happened with Hurricane Arthur. And so here is on the very surface of the sediments, Arthur in 2014, and there's the spike. We go back in time, there's another one here around 1975. Again, a lot of these, I'm not really sure what influence they had on Harvey, so I haven't put too much in there, but there was a spike. Something was going on. Gerda, we know, passed by, and here's a spike associated with that. There are various other sorts of spikes over time. I've kind of marked in some of the known hurricanes, but some of these may be other sorts of events. But there's a very strong signal here in the age model, right in the middle part of the 1860s, that is undoubtedly, I think, associated with the Saxby Gale of 1869. So this is sort of a blow up of that record. If we look at the whole record from that particular core, we can see these storms that I just talked about right here. And then we have some other ones. We're going back all the way to the latter part of the 15th century. And there's some other major events that are occurring as well. Interestingly to me is that when we went into this, the older part of this record, which is the Little Ice Age, we didn't, in that part of the world, we didn't come out of that near glacial age until the latter part of the 19th century. And it's interesting that it's since that time, there seems to be a lot more storm events have crossed across the Harvey area. And so I find that's just kind of notable. So we see these various sorts of storms. When you get deeper in time, you don't really know what's associated with what. The age model doesn't have a huge number of radiocarbon dates, so it needs to be a better one, I think, to be to track better. For example, this major spike here from the 18th century could very well be associated with the Newfoundland storm. I was talking with Jim Abraham, and he told me that in fact that was probably 2 storms, and one of them may have actually tracked right across this part of New Brunswick, in which case maybe that's what this particular spike might be. Certainly follow-on research, will be doing a lot better research on the age model that goes along with this. So that's talking about the storms. So I advertised in the title there'd be some sort of implications to do with cyanobacteria. So I think it's time to turn to that aspect of the story now. So I've told you already that with these major storms, we end up stirring up the water column much deeper than normal. Okay, so you're going much, much deeper. In Harvey Lake, you're pushing down as deep as 4.4 meters, and normally you'd never get anywhere near that. But it ends up, a lot of lake bottoms have a surface that's made up of very fine mud. There's a very thin veneer. It's just 3 to 5 millimeters generally. It's unconsolidated, it's very biologically active. And you end up that there's the surface, and if you get into the mud, it's often low oxygen, and it's very easy to stir up. And here's an example right here. So this is some work that we've been doing on Oromocto Lake, which is very nearby, looking at it's an ecological study that we've been carrying out there. And in the deeper part of the Whiteman's Cove, where we work there, the sediment on the bottom is fluff, basically. And as you're finning over it, when we're collecting our samples here on scuba, if you even touch that bottom, there's a huge cloud of mud gets carried up into the water column. So that sediment that's on these the lake bottoms is very easily resuspended, and it's a very primary vector for phosphorus transport. Okay, so it ends up that very thin superficial layer contains up to 90% of the phosphorus load that's going to be found in a lake. So it's basically sequestered there, but it doesn't take much to kick it up and put it into the water column. And when that phosphorus, which is a fertilizer, gets carried up, it's bioavailable into the water column, it's going to be used. And so this is basically looking at a phosphorus cycle in a lake, and here's the sediment resuspension right here. So you have a major storm crossing over, you end up all that very fine mud carrying all that phosphorus carried up into the water column, and then it can become fertilizer for any phytoplankton, including cyanobacteria, that are in the water column. So suddenly you just, with they're plants, you basically just add some sunlight, you add that fertilizer, and then they will start to grow. So it ends up that a lot of cyanobacteria can survive for a long time, okay? They can survive for longer than one overwintering period, and you end up that by overwintering a lot of these populations, if you have some sort of resuspension event going on, you can end up with these cyanobacteria. They're just sort of waiting in the wings, then can start to bloom and create a major bloom. And I think this is our hypothesis as what occurred in Harvey Lake and many other lakes in the year after Hurricane Arthur, because they had a major bloom in 2015, which I'll talk about more in just a second. So limiting factors for cyanobacteria, well, first of all, they need a lot of phosphorus or nitrogen, so that for their nutrients to grow. They'll grow much more easily in still and slow moving waters. They like it when it's warmer. So if you have a longer open water season, the water turns on earlier. The productivity will start earlier in the season, and it'll be warmer. You end up, high rainfall is conducive for blooms, because you end up with runoff from the catchment is carrying nutrients along with it. Strong winds, that's going to disturb substrate deeper and kick up more of that phosphorus-bearing sediments, and increased ice-free seasons are going to increase growth as well. And certainly cyanobacteria are well on the radar of people in New Brunswick. And so this is from the office of this chief medical officer, and advising people to look for cyanobacteria wherever it might be found. And here is an interesting list that I found on the chief medical officer of New Brunswick, and looking at blue-green algae advisories. And this map shows where these advisories are in New Brunswick. And what is interesting to me, and I've highlighted these in sort of pink here, in 2015, Arthur came through in 2014, again, stirred up a lot of lakes in the region, put a lot of sediment up in the water column, released lots of phosphorus, that we had a large number of lakes that never ever had any recorded, I should say that, cyanobacteria outbreaks before suddenly had these appearances the next year. So my idea is that these major storms, when they come through, kick up sediment and set the stage for cyanobacteria blooms the next year. And now, and I should sort of as an aside here, it seems on the New Brunswick blue-green algae advisory, if you get on the list, you never get off the list. So it's like a Harvey Lake right here, 2015 is when it occurred, and not since, but they're still on the list of as an advisory. So that's sort of, I guess, distressing for the people that live there. As far as like open water season, I'm just going to highlight a paper that I wrote in Climate Dynamics in 2015 that looked at the distribution of ice out seasons basically throughout the region. And basically, in this diagram right here shows that as you move farther from the coast, it ends up ice out seasons you might expect. It's later because coastal regions are going to warm up earlier, and also same with elevation. This is really, I think, a very useful bit of information, ice out, because it can provide you with some indication of over time how long has open water season been. And this is from the same paper, and what you can see here as we move from the latter part of the 19th century, the oldest ice out record in New Brunswick is from Oromocto Lake, where citizen scientists all the way from the 1876 have collected ice out data every year. Some places in New England back to 1822. Harvey Lake has it from 1973. And so there's a very close correlation between the instrumental records that exist and these ice out data. And with the ice out data, we can move back beyond the thermometer record. And that's going to be very useful for us if we're going back in time trying to assess cyanobacteria outbreaks and storm records by understanding what was the ice out season. Because with lakes, when they open up earlier in the spring, are going to have they're going to warm up earlier. There's going to be a lot more chance for cyanobacteria blooms to develop. Another proxy that we're going to be very interested in looking at in the Harvey Lake record is something called titanium. It's a metal. In this particular case, it's very concentrated in the Zmax region of the lake. Also in this inlet right here called Sucker Brook, which is draining off of the volcanic rocks that are here in Cherry Mountains. That's, I think, where it's derived from. Titanium is a runoff proxy. And then what you can do looking down through core with this, and one of my former PhD students, a professor at McMaster now, Ed Reinhardt, has an iTrax machine. And so we'd like to scan cores to look at titanium variation over time. One thing we'd like to look at is see, are there spikes that are associated with storms? And also changes over time can correlate with changes in general precipitation changes over time and runoff that's associated with that. So what the plan is for going back here is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the proxy for cyanobacteria in just a second, is we'll be collecting freeze cores. We did a glue core before, and glue cores are great, but they're susceptible to reworking. Freeze cores, we push them down to the bottom of the lake, and they're filled with dry ice. The dry ice basically as you push this in, sediment freezes to the surface of the core. It results in an absolutely perfectly preserved record of the sediment. And then when the frost line, here's the frost line right here, gets down towards the lake bottom, you pull the core out and you end up with a perfect record. And this is a record here that my students and I collected from a site near Brampton that they want to put a housing development on, which was a former shooting range. And so it's interesting, you can see here some glacial clays and all kinds of things. And then we x-rayed it, it was completely full of birdshot. So that was interesting. So that was the whole thing, but I should have put the x-ray in because that was kind of fun to look at. Here's another example right here, just gives you an idea how perfectly preserved these core records are. Here is, this is Frame Lake in Yellowknife. This is Glacial Lake McConnell. This little lake became isolated. It turned into a regular lake. These little gray bands right here towards the top, they were 3 years from 1969, 1970, and 1971 that they had a Christmas tree bonfire on the lake in January. And so we have a perfect record of that. And then we're looking at the sediment water interface. And we often will collect plants. So what we do then is we slice these up on our freeze core microtome that we have, and we can do our grain size analysis and various sorts of other analysis that we might be doing as well. And here's looking at the freeze core microtome. Now, as far as cyanobacteria, you say, well, how in the heck do you plan to look at a cyanobacteria down core? Well, it ends up that there are cyanotoxins called microcystins that are associated with cyanobacteria that are actually a very stable chemical, okay? So they are very widespread. These are what are generated by the various species of cyanobacteria. And there's something about more than 250 of these things. And so they don't break down very much due to biological or chemical breakdown. As a result, they end up becoming part of the sedimentary record. And so there are something like 250 of these congeners that go along with these things. 12 are commercially available. Okay, Carleton has these standards, and one of my new colleagues at Carleton in biochemistry, David McMullen, we're planning to work together to go down core, use LC-MS analysis to try and quantify the relative changes in these microcystins down core, with the idea that we would recognize various changes by the in-member mixing analysis are associated with storms, and then at the horizons right about there, because we're analyzing at sub-millimeter resolution with our microtome to try and recognize, are there microcystin spikes that might give us some indication that we were seeing blooms that are associated with these major storms. So that's, and then the titanium record that we'll collect will also tell us something about runoff at the same time. So the whole purpose of then is that as we go forward with this research, again, the big plan was to arrive back right now in Harvey Lake and to collect some freeze cores and to start analysis this summer. Because of the COVID-19 crisis, that's been delayed. So we will get there when we can, but to carry out this sort of a multi-disciplinary study, looking at the end members, recognizing paleostorm events, developing very robust age models to go along with that, using lead-210 dating as well. This time, I actually have a gamma spectrometer in my lab, but it's never been deployed because my lab burnt down a year ago. And so it'll hopefully be operational very soon. Then do the microcystin analysis and try and find to see, is there a correlation? And that might then give us a tool as we were going forward for policymakers and planners. If there is a major event like a Hurricane Arthur across the region, as for the next season, might help these people become more prepared for a potential blooms. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks a lot.